It's another week's edition of the International Sphere, whereas we are still focusing on wildlife conservation in the US. Some of the most beautiful and interesting souvenirs offered for sale abroad are made from the furs, hides, shells, feathers, teeth, and flesh of creatures threatened with extinction. Although tourists may lawfully buy such souvenirs in a number of foreign countries, it may be illegal to import them into the United States of America. Don't be fooled by the argument that the animal is already dead, so it doesn't matter if you buy something made from it. Should you buy items fashioned from endangered species, you would be adding to the demand for such products and supporting a market for which more animals will be killed. When you consider purchasing a wildlife product during your travels, first make sure you can legally bring it home. Don't rely on assurance by the vendor. Check with the U.S. Embassy or consular office, which can then contact the host country or the host government. A good rule is if your purchase is seized by customs or wildlife inspectors, and you might also find yourself subject to monetary penalties. Federal restrictions on import and export of protected animals also apply to hunters who take trophies business that deal in the animals for research or educational purposes. In an exclusive interview with Madam Koki, Wildlife Inspector, Law Enforcement, BWI, Air Cargo Building, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, she was eager to explain on various issues, but here she starts by telling us on the role of the Wildlife Inspector.
The role of a wildlife inspector is to enforce the federal wildlife laws of the United States. Our main thrust is commercial wildlife. So any imported or exported products that have any kind of wildlife component are required to file an entry with Fish and Wildlife and get clearance prior to exporting or importing. So for commercial wildlife, I mean, this is anything in the animal kingdom, a huge broad category. If you have mother of pearl buttons on a shirt, that's a wildlife product. And when it comes into the country for commercial purposes, it has to be cleared with Fish and Wildlife before it can enter the country. Most people know, exotic things like snake skin or crocodile. Of course, those are wildlife products and need clearance, but people don't think about the other things. A huge commodity that we deal with are monkey cells. Monkey cells are routinely exported from the United States and go overseas for the production of vaccines and other sources of medical use. So all the monkeys are protected under CITES, they all need permits to be exported, and people wouldn't even think that DNA from a wild animal is a wildlife product, and again, for commercial purposes. When it comes to passengers, travelers who are visiting other countries, we give a lot of leeway for those types of wildlife products coming in. You know, the only thing basically we're going to prohibit are endangered species, migratory bird products, marine mammal products, that kind of thing. But we give a lot of, we don't expect them to comply with the wildlife regulations that we require commercial importers or exporters to comply with. So it's a different category.
So what are the technologies, of course we've already seen, but what are the technologies that we use or tools that we use during the time of inspection?
Well, doing inspections is pretty much physical work. So, we'll have basic tools, a hammer, crowbar, drill, that kind of thing. So it's just hands-on, sweaty work. But the technology that can help us sometimes is we do, for instance, have an iPad and we have a little hotspot, a little wireless thing. So when we're out in a cargo facility, if we're not sure, what does a Nyala look like? here's some horns, I'm not sure they were Nyala horns like we saw earlier today, I could use my iPad and Google it and see what comes up, or hopefully it's a good source that we're looking at to get correct information. So, the technology out in the field is more informational to help us maybe look up a law, look up a species, what does it look like if it's something we're not used to seeing, that kind of thing. And then in the office, the big technology that we use, of course, is electronic filing. So since we have a lot of commercial filers, they or their broker will file the declaration and the paperwork electronically. So we would just go onto our electronic declaration, our eDec system, and we can pull up what's declared to be coming in or going out of our port and kind of handle it that way. So that, and when we make a seizure, wildlife inspectors will follow it through all the way to the end. So we'll seize, say, the tortoiseshell, the sea turtle bracelet, and we send the importer a notice of seizure. If they abandon it, then we wait the appropriate amount of time and we do a final closure of that report. We do a case report. We have an evidence room where we log in the evidence and keep everything very secure, very much by the law. And then once it's government property, we use it for educational purposes, or we'll send it to our repository. So our national repository will take all the wildlife seized items that we can't use locally.
What types of items are confiscated?
Well, anything that's endangered is going to be prohibited, whether it's personal baggage or through commercial. We don't see as much through commercial, but personal, that's where we get it. So anything, a lot of the crocodilian species, crocodiles rather, are prohibited. Let's see, tiger, of course, rhino, of course, polar bear items, caviar. So the black caviar coming out of the Caspian Sea, Black Sea area, it's the tiny black caviar eggs. Those can be a problem coming through personal baggage. We allow a passenger to have a small quantity, 125 grams, not a big amount. Before it would be considered a commercial import and permits would be required. And then the beluga caviar, the beluga sturgeon rather, is on the endangered species list, listed as threatened, so that would be prohibited from personal baggage. Ivory, of course, is a huge concern right now. So the elephant ivory in particular coming out of Africa is prohibited. So even if CITES isn't addressing it to the point that we do, the African Elephant Conservation Act prohibits it. So each law has, I won't say loopholes, but each law has provisions whereby certain wildlife that would otherwise be prohibited can come in. So even with elephant ivory, African elephant ivory, if an importer can meet certain criteria and have the proper permits for the proper reason to bring it in, we will allow it in, but it's very controlled. It's a very controlled process.
Why and how do people attempt to hide the items?
They can be very creative, that's for sure. In personal shipments that are coming in through passengers, if they, if somebody is trying to bring in live wildlife, they're not going to put it in ocean freight. And they may fly it in by air cargo, but a lot of times if it's a few things, they're going to put it in their luggage or on their person. So unfortunately, when they do it that way, they don't want the animal to move or make noise. And so they're taping beaks shut, they're putting them in, wrapping cloth around them so they don't move, and maybe putting them under their pants, putting them around their waist. It's a very inhumane way to transport wildlife, and that is certainly a smuggling scenario, not, oops, I bought the wrong thing when I was looking for a souvenir. So that's treated in a very different way as well. We do have humane transport regulations that we enforce. So even wildlife coming in legally, if they don't meet the requirements for humane transport, we can seize the wildlife based upon that. Or we can, if it's better for the wildlife not to be seized, we may issue a ticket. Depending on how bad the infraction is, we may issue, say, a ticket to the importer. So a monetary fine and say, you know, this is your penalty for this. If you don't straighten it up, then it's going to be worse the next time. But we also want to take into account the wildlife. I mean, when we seize live wildlife, we need to make sure that we have some place we can, who will take it and take care of it properly. I mean, we certainly don't want to do anything to cause the wildlife to incur any more suffering than they already have when it's an inhumane transport situation. So we're very aware of that as well. Yeah.
What are the steps taken once seized the items or wildlife animals?
Okay, so if it's live wildlife and we do seize it, we have an agreement with, like, the American Zoological Association that, say, a local zoo will take care of that wildlife until the case has been gone through the process. And then we try to find a home for the wildlife that meets our requirements, educational, some kind of sanctuary situation. If it's a product, then we go ahead and do the seizure. And again, we log it into our seizure room. It's very strict regulations there when we're dealing with someone's property that we've taken. And through that seizure process, the government eventually will take custody of that wildlife and it will become our property. So at that point, we can detain it for our own use or send it to the repository where it will be donated out, hopefully, to other institutions that want to educate the public about wildlife. So.
And how do you inform the people about the laws?
We actually have to go by the CAFRA regulations. That's the Civil Asset Reform Forfeiture Act. CAFRA, Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act. So that's basically a form letter that describes when we seized it, where we seized it, what law was violated, and what their options are at that point. So they can file a petition for remission of forfeiture. And when that happens, we send the information to our solicitor's office. That's like the government's civil lawyers. And they would review the petition and determine whether or not their extenuating circumstances warrants return of the wildlife that we seized. Rarely does that happen, but occasionally it does. Sometimes people are traveling overseas or they're living overseas for a couple of years and they bought something that they want to bring back and they've contacted our embassy and the embassy gave them incorrect information. So that potentially could be a scenario where the solicitor would say, you know, you did your best. The government actually gave you wrong information, therefore we won't penalize you for that. That's maybe a potential scenario. Elephant footstool was part of a household goods shipment. And it was coming in from, believe it or not, a State Department employee. This was years ago as well. And it happened in the late 80s, 1980s. And that was the time when the African Elephant Conservation Act was passed in 1988. So the protection status on the African elephant was changing. And we got a tip from another state employee, State Department employee, who said that this individual was smuggling in ivory. And so we did pull up, we called up the container of his household goods for inspection. And we had a special agent come out as well, and we found a lot of ivory items in there, and they were all tagged for resale. Clearly not a few souvenirs. Also, because of the African Elephant Conservation Act legislation, this entire thing was prohibited. He had no permits, he didn't declare it, it was a clear case of smuggling. So all of his items were seized. And he had a few, besides the ivory and the elephant footstool, he also had this elephant tail, and he had some stuffed crocodiles as well. So all of those items were seized. They were all considered a smuggling situation, but that's where that came from. Okay. This lovely handbag, it was coming out of Nigeria. In Nigeria, all of their crocodilians are listed as endangered, and they are prohibited from import. Now, there are certain species of crocodiles that can come in with the proper permits, or in the case of personal baggage, if it's from one of the countries that we allow them in from, they can bring it in. However, this species is the African dwarf crocodile. And it's actually the whole animal, this is an adult, was used to make this purse. This is an endangered species, and there are no exceptions. We do not allow this in. So we have various wildlife laws that we enforce. These are federal laws. Most people are familiar with the Endangered Species Act. Of course, CITES is international, so all countries, including the Tanzanian Management Authority, should be well aware of that. We have some other U.S. laws that a lot of times foreign countries are not aware of, nor would we really expect them to be. I certainly don't know all the Tanzanian wildlife laws. I know some foreign laws, of course, but certainly not every country's laws. So when somebody goes, say, to Iceland, and they buy this puffin. Puffins are not on the endangered species list. They're not even on the CITES treaty. So, of course, when you're in Iceland, they're going to tell you it's fine to purchase and travel with overseas, and that would normally be the case. However, we have a law called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that protects all migratory birds, and they are prohibited from being imported or exported. You'd have to have a permit for it, but they're not issued for personal use. It's only for scientific or educational reasons. So anytime people buy a souvenir like this, when they come back into the country, we do seize it. So I wouldn't expect, the Iceland people to know that we've got this kind of unusual law. We have the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So any marine mammals, like this mitten was made out of polar bear fur. Now, polar bears have since gotten more protection, but at the time, the only protection they had was that they were a marine mammal, and they were prohibited under that law. We have the Rhino Tiger Act, which is a labeling law. If any, say, Asian medicinals claim to have tiger or rhino in them, that's enough reason for us to seize the product. Otherwise, we would have to prove that that product was in there. And with, at least if it's a homeopathic remedy, the dilution is so great that you would not be, our lab can't detect the DNA in there of a tiger or a rhino. So that's why that law was passed, saying if you say it's in there, either by having a picture or a Chinese character that means tiger or rhino, that's all we need to make the seizure.
Okay. Can you say something on this? Yeah.
This one, I actually did make this seizure. And this was when I was an inspector in New Orleans. And we covered the flights. They were coming in during the day, so I was over at the terminal along with CBP. And we were inspecting some, I don't know what flight it was, but we had passengers from Ghana and Nigeria on the flight. So one of the suitcases had this in it. And I don't know about you, but the first thing I think of when I see this is, why do you have a gorilla hand in your suitcase? And the nails were painted. And the answer was that in their country, they kept a gorilla hand in their kitchen to bring good spirits into the home. So I like to use this when I give talks to school groups and other public venues and say, you know, most of the time you hear, well, species become endangered because species. And so that, I think, can also be very hard to change if it's deeply embedded in the culture. It's kind of that way with the rhino horn as well. When the rhino horn is used for ceremonial things, it's very deep into that culture. This I did not seize myself, but this is a gorilla skull. It didn't come in with the hand. This was a separate shipment, and I don't really know the circumstances under which this came in, but of course that would be prohibited. Commercial importer had the required CITES permit, but they did not, and therefore these were seized. We do give leeway to souvenirs that are coming in through personal baggage for personal use. So if these items came in through personal baggage for personal use, I would not have seized them. But items that we have here that are made from endangered species cannot come in even through personal baggage for personal use. We do seize those from the passenger. Now, when passengers come in and Fish and Wildlife inspectors are not on duty, then we do rely on U.S. Customs and Border Protection to be on the lookout for us. So items that come in through personal baggage may be detained by Customs and referred to us for action. CBP, yes, and referred to us for action. And at that point, we would take custody of the items and continue with the seizure process. So for instance, if we had a passenger coming from, say, Mexico, and they bought this bracelet. Do you know what the bracelet is made out of?
What is it made out of?
This is made from the hawksbill sea turtle. So all the sea turtles are endangered, and the hawksbill, because of the beautiful shell, they will take these scutes off and make them into jewelry. But since these are endangered species, it doesn't matter if it's the whole turtle like this, a bracelet made from the turtle shell, or even the egg. We don't have any here, but sea turtle eggs look like little ping pong balls, nice and round and white. And even the eggs would be prohibited. So this would be detained by Customs, CBP, and we would take custody of it, say the next day that we're on duty. And at that point, we will send the importer a notice of seizure and proposed forfeiture. And they can abandon the item to us, or we go through a forfeiture process if they don't want to abandon it. But either way, they lose the property, they lose whatever they paid for it, because we certainly would not reimburse anybody for prohibited wildlife. And that's considered really the penalty that they pay for importing a prohibited species. Now, we do have occasions where we have smuggling going on. Smuggling is treated a whole different way than somebody who inadvertently buys a souvenir that is prohibited. And when we have smuggling, for instance, we had a case here, it's been quite a few years ago now, but on a Sunday morning, a passenger was coming in from South America, and CBP did a physical inspection on his suitcase, and they found hundreds of baby Chaco tortoises live, hidden in his clothing, under the suitcase like a false layer. And we did respond to that. We actually had a special agent come out. So the law enforcement division is made up of wildlife inspectors and special agents, as well as our support staff, of course. Special agents do the investigating work. They can work undercover, they're not in uniform. They also have arrest authority, and they carry weapons. Wildlife inspectors do not carry weapons, and we do not have arrest authority. So when this seizure, or this smuggler came in, we did call out a special agent, and Customs, I believe, may have been the one to arrest him. I'm not sure now if it was a wildlife agent or Customs that did it, but at any rate, the smuggler was arrested. So all of his items were confiscated, of course, and he was taken to Baltimore City Jail and was later deported. So as I said, Smuggling is a whole different scenario and treated in a whole other way than someone who just inadvertently bought the wrong thing when they were traveling.
Well, that's all for now, as in this episode focusing on the wildlife conservation in the US, and this being among the series.